welcome today. My name is Lana Klab, and thank you for joining me. Today we have Chase Hanson and Erika Kelley as my co-hosts. And today we're going to be talking about Jeff Koons, kind of who he is and why is it that people like him or don't like him. And so today we're really going to be focusing on one particular video that was made. It was made by the channel Downhill Media. It was uploaded in March of this year. And it's called I Hate Jeff Koons and Why You Do Too. So I guess kind of as a background, I personally didn't know who Jeff Koons was until I think it was Chase who brought up, kind of talking about Jeff Koons for this. And all I know about him is that he's the guy who made the giant balloon animals. I think what museum was that stored in? I don't remember, but it's all like pretty expensive, kind of kitsch is I think how you described it, Chase, his work.
Yeah, Wikipedia calls him a post-pop artist because he doesn't necessarily hit the same kind of political considerations or criticisms that pop art does. But it's in that same kind of vein of pop art. It's brightly colored, it's plasticky, everything's always very, very shiny, and the reflection of light's always a big consideration. Just these kind of big, in-your-face, pretty pieces of art. And over the last few decades, he's risen up to be one of the biggest, most famous, and priciest names in the industry, in the art industry.
Right. And just to add to that, I believe that it was, I forgot the name of it, but it's one of his sculptures where it's basically like a giant metal bunny. And that is the most expensive piece that was ever sold by a living artist, which is insane when you think about it. So kind of as a background to kind of start about why he's kind of a controversial to many people is that he's kind of like a salesman. And it's interesting because when you look at him and his background, he has a background, being in sales. And then the video that we're talking about in particular, they mentioned how, when he was working, as he started working in the Museum of Modern Art as a salesman selling memberships, and he sold like 5 times the amount of memberships of other people. And he said that his tactic to do so was by wearing bright and interesting clothing that kind of captures people's attention and keeps it on him while he's trying to sell them these memberships. And it's interesting because when I heard that, I was like, oh shoot, that's basically what his art is doing too. If you think about it, like you said, Chase, it's the bright, it's kind of, relating to pop. It's, how light reflects, and, there's a lot of shiny things and colorful things in a lot of his art. So yeah. And talking about, the same video by Downhill Media, they mentioned that when he describes his art, a lot of buzzwords are used.
You can definitely tell sometimes that he has a strong marketing background, and the video definitely brings that up as one of their primary criticisms, is that he's a guy who made his early career in marketing, got a marketing degree, learned everything there is to know about selling people, and then afterwards got into art and kind of used a lot of the same strategies and techniques, not just in the way that he represents his art and like if he's selling his art to galleries, but in the art itself sometimes seems very marketing driven.
Definitely.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Certainly a lot of artists probably should market themselves a bit better, me for one. But we have this tendency to kind of assume an insincere cast to anything like that from that background off of the start. And the critic, the Artsplain video, definitely felt a lot of that insincerity coming in through the ideas that he says, although those aren't necessarily the ideas that the art tackles sometimes, what he talks about. One issue she took was that the art doesn't seem to have a lot of inherent meaning until afterwards Jeff Koons comes in and gives it meaning and explains it to you.
Right.
Which,
yeah, when you come in like as an art outsider, it does seem like a lot of arts, especially modern art, does kind of have, not a lot of meaning unless like you look at, the environment around it. And one thing that comes to mind is when we look at Duchamp, in his piece, the fountain, where it's basically this urinal. And I think that when people critique a lot of modern art, it's because like, okay, what's the meaning? It's a urinal, or like if you look at paintings, like it's just like a stripe down the middle, you know. But it's interesting to think like, why is his work criticized, but not a lot of other other modern art as well, you know, because the meaning is never obvious, which is what they were saying in the video. But why is his meaning so much different than others, you know?
I think it's interesting that he, like you both have been saying, that he comes from a marketing background, and he's putting so much effort into marketing himself and his work, that I'm wondering if it's just that he's marketing himself and his art as a way to make money, and that is what's upsetting people. Like you said, he doesn't really apply a meaning to it until after people have started like questioning what the meaning is. So I think it's interesting that he's this artist that's so well known, but people are upset with him for trying to make money. But that's kind of what all artists are trying to do. Like I think we like to have this idea that artists, and they make these things because they're creative and they want to make a statement. But I feel like a lot of the times other artists are just like trying to make money. Like they have a gift and they're trying to make money. So it's interesting that Coons is the one that is getting all the controversy, and some of it he deserves. But like when it comes to like the marketing aspect, I think it's interesting that he's the one that everyone is upset with, when there's other people that are doing the exact same thing, just maybe not as blatant.
Right, definitely. And it's funny when we think about because people like to say like, oh, you're only in it for the art, not the money, but it's like, but I also need to live. So I definitely think that, you know, it's not wrong to have money as a motive. I think what it comes down to is that your only motive. And um, another artist that comes to mind is Thomas Kincaid. So I think he's kind of known as, you know, the one of the most popular artists, I think, not necessarily for the right reasons. So like if you ever go to Target or, you know, Walmart or something, you want to buy a puzzle, you're gonna see like half the puzzle aisle is gonna be Thomas Kincaid. Or if you go to like Hobby Lobby, for example, and you're gonna buy a calendar, it's gonna be Thomas Kincaid, or, you know, Christian, you know, Home Goods, or he has
And,
like little stores in malls too with all his stuff, you
and
know?
even if it isn't actual Thomas Kincaid by name, it's somebody who's trying very, very hard to be him. They're using the exact same like landscapes with the soft fuzzy light coming out of a little cottage, the same bright and starry skies, or the same color palette. They're all trying to be Kincaid, or and his style, his brand, his genre, even if they aren't actually him.
Yeah. And he definitely has, you know, this style that was developed to kind of, you know, appeal to a certain demographic. You know, and that's, you know, kind of like, I don't want to say like, you know, it's your suburban mom, but like that's kind of what comes to mind when like you see these paintings, where you know, it definitely has this certain style of, you know, it's supposed to, you know, bring you to nostalgia and like give you those fuzzy warm feelings, and but that's kind of it, you know. Um, but he was hated by a lot of people because, you know, he wasn't making the art for the art, but just for the money. You know, he really made a brand of himself. Even when it came to, you know, he has a whole series of Disney paintings where, you know, Disney is so good if you want to make a lot of money because everyone loves Disney, it seems. And so mixing that with, you know, these warm, fuzzy nostalgia paintings um, is kind of like the key for him to make money. Um, so it seems like Koons might have that in his own way. You know, he has those big statues, you know, the colors, the lights, the reflections are all really popular. And then even just talking about, you know, pop and, you know, the world we live in, like, for example, one piece that comes to mind is he has a statue of Michael Jackson with, I think, Bubba the monkey. And that's one piece that comes to mind because, you know, it's Michael Jackson. Everyone knows him and loves him. And it's this, you know, shiny statue of him. And so it seems that, you know, Koons might have his own formula for making money, which I think people don't agree with.
And that reminds me of, they talked about in the video, the statue that he gave to the French people, or the French prime minister, after the 2015 terrorist attacks, I believe, where it was just like a handful of tulips, which was very pretty, but the art was supposed to commemorate like the terrible thing that happened. But when they were talking about the art, they never mentioned a single victim or talked about like anything that was going to happen after that. And he also, the taxpayers had to pay for that art installation. So I think it just goes back to the fact that he's trying to make money and not like really making a statement.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a lot to look at when it comes to that specific work, because his kind of brand is built on literally banality, kind of boring as things that are apparent at face value. And so there's a lot of tension there when he tries to tackle a very, very serious topic, but it's also perhaps he let his own brand weigh things in too much. He didn't handle it on the level of like accepting that scene and that atmosphere he needs to go for, and instead introduce a little bit too much of his own genre in it, a little too much of his plasticky prettiness.
Right. It was too much of a Jeff Koons piece and not enough of, a piece to commemorate, a tragic event. Yeah. And just going back to that, his art at face value, we kind of mentioned that a lot of people don't like how he uses buzzwords to describe his stuff. So like there's certain tactics that I think artists use, at least him, to give his piece meanings. Because when you look at, like, for example, the statue of Michael Jackson with his monkey, at face value, we say, okay, it's Michael Jackson and his monkey. That's all there is to it. But then, he kind of goes into in the video that we're talking about by Downhill Media. They showed a quote of him talking about his piece and describing the meaning behind it, some of the symbolisms that he uses, and he mentions how, the way that Michael Jackson is leaning is, it references the Pieta made by, Michelangelo years ago, hundreds of years ago. And then the way that, the statue's proportions kind of relates to the pyramids of Giza, all these kind of things. It's like pulling, certain, important things from history, as well as like buzzwords like using masculinity, femininity, mortality, a lot of things that artists like to focus on, but it doesn't seem to have a clear direction. Like, okay, maybe this relates to the Pieta and maybe this relates to the pyramids, but what does that mean? It's kind of like pulling random strings in a way.
The big thing I think that his work has in common with that of Marcel Duchamp is that both of their work, it's very, very easy to read, no matter how invested into art or how much of a layperson you are. It's very easy to read, but it's very, very difficult to understand unless you're already kind of in tune with those ideas. When you see Marcel Duchamp's urinal sitting in a museum, you clearly know something's up. You clearly know this is some kind of joke making fun of somebody. You can clearly tell it's poking at what your idea of art is, but that doesn't mean you can necessarily really, really understand it on a lower level. You won't, if you're just seeing this offhand walking into a museum off the street without having any idea of the context, you won't necessarily immediately get what he's poking at in terms of our conceptions of art. You won't get what he's poking at in curation. But it's very easy to read. You see that urinal on a pedestal and you get something is up. And Koons's work is the same way. You see a shiny metal balloon animal and you clearly get that it's supposed to poke at something about childhood, that it has something to do with the shininess and the bright colors. It's easy enough to read, but to really, really get what he's trying to say is something else entirely. And I think it's safe to say there's a far bigger gulf in Koons's work between that reading and understanding than there is in Duchamp. In Duchamp, you don't need to look very, very deeply to get that he's looking at the museum itself and not at the work. Whereas with Koons, I don't think most people are going to get the statues of or the pyramids of Giza in a statue of Michael Jackson, no matter how much they look at it, no matter how much they look into the significance of the icons, without Jeff Koons saying something.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like people also critique Koons because of his use of ready-mades, where it's like you're just kind of recreating or literally taking things that have already been produced and then turning it into art, which is what Duchamp did with his fountain, because it was an actual urinal. It wasn't like Duchamp made the urinal. It was an actual urinal, and so he's the one who kind of really not brought to light, but started, this use of ready-mades. And I do think Duchamp and all the people in the past, they were critiqued for what they did, but now we're kind of looking at it and being like, okay, we get why they did it. We're kind of more accepting of it now, and I think it's kind of in hindsight. Like, for example, Cubism wasn't accepted in the mainstream art world. Neither was Impressionism or Surrealism, but today it's high forms of art. So I guess the question comes is that, are we critiquing Koons because he's ahead of us and like that's where the art direction is going, or is it kind of like he's doing things that all have already been done but doing money, like making money out of it, if that makes sense? Like for example, like I said, like Duchamp, he used ready-mades. He just brought a urinal into a museum and that was art. And Koons, he's bringing a giant, like a balloon animal into museum. That's art, where it's kind of the same thing. But I don't know, is Koons doing something that's beyond us?
I think that there also is like becoming a disconnect, like add on to what you were saying, is that there's becoming like a disconnect between like maybe the general audience and then the audience Koons is trying to appeal to. Because from what I can see, it seems like, again, a main driving force in his art is making money and making as much of it as possible. So I think that the art that he's starting to create is being generated towards people that can afford to spend millions of dollars on a single piece of artwork, so that those people, if they can afford to spend that much money, they can afford to like sit down and do the research and maybe even talk to him. But we as like a general public, we're not like Chase said, people are just going to come into a museum off the street who aren't going to have a lot of background, so they're not going to actually understand it. So I think that that's also a very distinct difference that Jeff Koons is trying to create, where it's maybe he's trying to make art not for everyday people to analyze, but for rich people or more like artistically inclined people to sit and critique and understand.
Yeah, definitely. And, just kind of off on a tangent on that. He's kind of doing, what he is, like we said, to make money and things like that. People are kind of like, to what extent? And so where I'm going with this is that he has faced a lot of lawsuits because of plagiarism, where he takes a photograph and makes a sculpture out of it, that kind of a thing. And people still love the art, like despite the fact that he's been. I think there was one series of his alone that pulled him into like 5 different lawsuits. Because he's taking things that other people did and kind of making it his in a way, and then reselling it, to make money. So that also poses the question now of, is that plagiarism, or is that taking inspiration from? Is it appropriating? It's kind of bringing up that issue of, in the art world, of what counts as plagiarism or what counts as inspiration, and where is that line?
Yeah, there's of course always been a tradition, back to certainly going to Duchamp himself, of taking somebody's work and changing it and making it your own and claiming it to say something about that work. But Jeff Koons definitely doesn't just ride the line. He's kind of demanding that we define the line here and now. Like he says, no more just general ballparks of this is definitely not plagiarism or this is definitely plagiarism. He's really asking us to no. You draw your line in the sand right here and now, so we can get this over with and figure it out. And that's very difficult. It's very difficult, and especially sometimes in the context of his works, where he's effectively just recreating a photo as a sculpture, or even recreating a photo as a photo, almost dot for dot sometimes. Where do we say that it's acceptable use, where it's making a new original work, and what isn't?
Yeah, and that reminds me of the piece by Duchamp, LHOOQ, which it's basically the Mona Lisa with a mustache. And I don't think a lot of people see that as plagiarism, because he did something that makes you look at the original piece differently. Like now we're questioning, what is art? What is the value that we attach to art? And he's making fun of the Mona Lisa. I mean, it's funny. Like he gave the Mona Lisa a mustache and a goatee. So I think that a lot of people say that it's not plagiarism if you add something to it, if you bring a new perspective, if you bring a new opinion or idea to the table. And so that leaves a lot of gray area, because what a new perspective or idea or opinion is very subjective. So that's kind of like where it's hard to draw that line, I think.
I think it's interesting that for most artists, especially contemporary artists, we really look past the execution and the techniques involved and what it takes to make an actual work. And we're looking more at the ideas and the thoughts behind it. We're not looking at what they're making, we're looking at what they're saying with the work. And with Jeff Koons, we're kind of flipping things on its head in a world where we're very much oftentimes past looking at the brush strokes and we're looking at the ideas. We don't care much for the ideas behind Koons's art, but we're making a very, very big deal about the work itself. We're making a big deal about how he's making stuff, why he's making stuff, than necessarily what it's saying. Because certainly most of us can agree that, yeah, bright, shiny balloons, something capitalism, something banality. But to really look at whether or not it's a good thing for him to just paint a reflective ball onto a painting and say, this is my painting now. It's something different than the way we analyze or look at most other artists ever, much less in contemporary art.
And I think that that goes back to what Lana was saying earlier, was that is Jeff Koons ushering us into a new movement of art, or like a new era of art where it's like Jace was saying, it's nothing like we've seen before. So while he's facing a lot of criticism now, he could be like the starting, or one of the starting artists of this new movement that people look back on in the past and be like, I can't believe there was any controversy around this. He's a new thinker and everything like that.
Definitely. So I think, at the end of the day, no matter if he's good or bad, the fact is that he's making a lot of money, right? I mean, he kind of has, the record for, like we said, the most expensive art piece ever sold by a living artist, which is a huge thing. And so based off of that, we're going to kind of switch topics a little bit, and we're going to talk about number 3 on that list. So Jeff Koons he takes the top, number 1 of, living artist who sold piece the most expensive. He takes that. Right under him is Hockney. And then follow that is a new artist, relatively new, I think, named Beeple, I believe is how you say it. And so we're going to kind of switch and talk about that, because what's interesting about this piece is that it's a JPEG. And it sold for $69.3 million. So this is according to an article by Scott Rayburn of the New York Times titled JPEG file sells for $69 million as NFT mania gathers pace. So we're going to start talking about, Jeff Koons is kind of like the new artist of the time, kind of spearheading something, but there's also a new art movement happening, and that's NFTs. So just as a disclaimer, I don't fully understand NFTs. I don't think any of us here will fully understand it. I think Chase, when we talked about it earlier, you seem to have the most understanding. So do you want to kind of give a brief, layman's, simple to understand, NFTs for dummy description of it?
Basically, the idea is that they can make a digital copy of a work, and you can say that you own it. So it's kind of like a certificate of authenticity or a certificate of ownership. I'm very much a cynic on it, but I've likened it to my friends as kind of the old name a star. Scam is the wrong word, but a business model.
Right.
Where you there's a company, they say, if you pay us money, we'll give you a certificate that says you have a name on this star. And if anybody asks us, you have it and it's yours. And when it comes to NFTs, there's another layer on this where, let's say I own an NFT of Jeff Koons' Balloon Dog. So I own this certificate that says this site says that I own this copy of Balloon Dog. I can then trade it to other people. I can sell my certificate of ownership on the Balloon Dog to somebody else for whatever they're willing to pay for it. So a very, very big and integral aspect, I'll say, from the very, very first word that any NFT manufacturer talks about, they always talk about it's a market. You're not in it to hold this, you're in it to sell this. It's a very economics and very, very financially focused sphere.
Right. and that's in the name itself, right? Because it's NFT, so it's non-fungible token, I believe is what it's called. So it's that token of, this is, the authentic, this is the certificate that, legitimizes it almost. And we also see this a lot. And I think it's the new thing that's been happening is digital, like baseball trading cards, but I think it's basketball now.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I first heard about it, where it's used, where, we have digital things. Normally digital things don't have value to it because you can always make copies. And, a JPEG is JPEG. It's not really that, interesting, but when you have an NFT to it, it gives it that level of, this is the one, this is the token that, this is the unique one. So it's interesting because, before, like we said, like a JPEG, you can always make copies of it. And it was hard for digital artists for a while to make money like Jeff Koons or, Hockney were, because they can always make copies and, things like that. Whereas now digital artists can use NFTs to give their art, that seal of authenticity, that declaration, like this is the one piece. And now it's creating this scarcity and this rarity in digital arts that is exciting for digital artists because now they can make that money. Like, for example, this guy, Beeple, he sold his piece for $69.3 million, and that's because it was an NFT. And so the piece itself, it's called Every Days, the First 5,000 Days. And so it's basically this collage of works that he did, that he, I think, posted to Instagram or posted to something, that he posted every day for 5,000 days. So it's a collage of those. So it's, I feel like, the art world's kind of moving in this new direction of digital, which is kind of suiting during our time because we're in the, the virtual era, especially because of the pandemic. So it seems like, this is a new place for digital artists to kind of get their foothold.
And I think it's interesting because I know that I never really paid much attention to digital art. I was very much I want like a physical piece of art. If I'm going to pay for something, I want to be able to like hold it and see it, or at least like go see it in a museum or something like that. So I think it's interesting that this new market is creating a new market that has previously been kind of hard for digital artists to create and gain notoriety. Like you said, Lana, like there are some drawbacks to it, but it is giving people new names and new ways to make money and like show off their work and get credit for it and everything like that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, before digital artists, really the only way that they can make their money was, I think we talked about this during our practice for this. I think Chase, you brought up that, really the only way that they could before was through commissions.
Yeah, and there are even this isn't necessarily commissions for like individual people stumbling in off of DeviantArt, that kind of thing. There's definitely a whole industry around commissions. Every time you open up Amazon.com and you see some drawing on the front page with some like mom leaning over a table with the nice lamp they just bought from Amazon, there's definitely a huge industry in digital art around commissions. One specific one that I know about is card games, trading card games like Magic the Gathering. If they're releasing 200 cards every 3 months all year long, every single year, and every single one of those cards needs its own little art, they do a lot of commission contracts. They'll go to an artist, say, here's our rate, we pay flat, we just want to buy a painting from you, we want it to look something like this, give them a short description, get it back, and then send them a check for the price of that painting.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a practicing artist who just spends all year just making art for Magic cards, making 10, 15 paintings every couple months and pushing them out like that, selling them one-to-one, your market is very, very limited to that standard deal with Wizards of the Coast making their trading cards. You don't necessarily have a way to argue and negotiate that value up much higher. You don't have much of a market outside of them. You're just kind of stuck in that one thing. So NFTs does allow these artists to kind of reach past that. Say, we don't need somebody distributing our work. We don't need some big buyer. We can start selling it to individual collectors or people who want art. or economists and people trying to make money off of your art, which can run the value up even higher sometimes than a collector.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember when I was reading through that New York Times article about the piece that sold for 69 million, that it was an auction, and it was until like at the last minute, it was only at 30 million. I mean, I say only as if it's not a lot. I mean, 30 million is still a crazy amount. But it was only in like the last 2 minutes that the price skyrocketed because people kept bidding for it because, like, it's this new thing, it's NFT, and, it's seen as this hot commodity and everyone wants to get their hands on it now. And so it seems like all handy dandy and fine now, because, digital artists have this way of making money and things like that. But the thing is, like all things, there's always something that's too good to be true. And I feel like NFTs are kind of one of them. Because, as nice as it sounds, to have, a digital seal of authenticity for your work and things like that. One interesting thing that I don't think is really obvious with NFTs is what they do to the environment. And so when I first heard that NFTs were bad for the environment, I was like, how is that possible? I mean, it's digital. It's not like there's like a factory and they're producing these with, all these resources or something like that. It's digital. How can it be, bad for the environment? But when you look into it, it's because of the amount of energy it takes for a computer, well, I guess multiple computers, to produce an NFT, not only to just make it, but to trade it, to show like, okay, this person holds it in their digital wallet. That takes a crazy amount of energy, which is something that really shocked me when I first heard about NFTs.
Yeah, the whole system is very, very dependent on energy, just raw energy. However much energy you put in is how much money you get out a lot of the times, in cryptocurrency without touching on NFTs. So when an NFT comes into play, you're talking about specifically putting in a whole bunch of energy into a computer for it to just give you a number and letter that says, this is your NFT. And the system fundamentally works on kind of the more energy you put in, the more comes out. It requires this level of energy investment that you push through a computer to make the NFT. And when it comes to the big services, we're not talking about like an iPhone or an iPad or even a laptop's worth of energy. We're talking more like something like one person looking to get into the business would probably get a computer that takes 10, 20 times more energy than a common laptop, and then stringing together 100 of them, and then running those 24 hours a day for 4 months until the very parts burn out and wear out. And that's one person. That's one setup, and that wouldn't be a particularly large setup.
Right. And then just to add to that, to kind of put into perspective how much energy these costs. So in order to track a single NFT, and this isn't even to make it, this is just to track, who has it, which digital wallet is it in. In order to do that for one NFT, it's the same amount of power that you need to fly from London to Rome, which is insane when you think about it, especially because like that's one simple, thing to track an NFT. When you talk about how many NFTs there are, the amount it is to track all of them, when it comes to, trading them, that's another thing that adds onto it. And that's not even talking about making it itself, which is crazy when you think about it. And so just going based off of that, there's this website or a site called Super Rare, which is kind of like a trading place. And it's a site to kind of hold NFTs, especially for digital art. I guess it's called crypto art now. And so from that site alone, the footprint of all the NFTs they have on there is the equivalent of, I'll go through a few. They made a few comparisons about what it's equivalent to, just to put it in perspective. It's the same as one European resident's electricity consumption for about 2,000 years. It's the same amount of energy you need to fly for 37,000 hours, and it's the amount of energy that a computer needs to run for 15,000 years, which is insane when you think about it. And now it comes down to the question of, is it worth it for digital artists to go in it, to make their living and to really make their way in the art worlds, is it worth it when you think about the environmental impacts?
I think it's interesting that when these new kind of fields that obviously are bad for the environment come into play, there's so much focus put on like the individual's responsibility for like creating this much waste, when I feel like a lot of the people don't put any of the responsibility on the companies making the NFTs either. Like this is a big thing, in my opinion, with like the meat industry, is like you can tell people to go vegan or vegetarian, but there's also different ways and more sustainable ways that you can like house these like and like produce meat for people to consume. So I think the same thing goes for NFTs, where these artists, they need to be credited, they need to get proper compensation for the art that they're creating, and if it's worth $60 million, it's worth $60 million. But I feel like there is a couple workarounds that these companies like Super Rare can do to make their work like more sustainable. Like I don't know exactly what kind of energy they're using, but I feel like it most likely is probably like coal or like fossil fuels or something like that. But there's more sustainable energies like solar energies that these larger companies can start instating. And I think, I forget which article it was in, but I remember some of the people, like some of these companies are saying that, oh, we tried doing that, but it didn't work, or like we're going to start implementing these, but they don't. So I think it's interesting that all the responsibility is put on the single artist and not on the larger company, where I think more of the blame or responsibility should be put.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. There are reasons, there's pros and cons with any technique or technology base, and there are reasons why they do it with the proof of work system, it's called, that takes up so much energy. But as you say, there's definitely not enough of a look on these sites that are minting the coins, that are making the NFTs and hosting them. We look at an artist and go, oh, do you know how much carbon your work made? Do you know how much energy your NFT made? But we don't look at the site that's hosting the NFT with a few thousand more on it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
I like that point.
And I feel like, just to bring it back, like, it's not like the art world was always environmentally conscious. I feel like we never were, like, dating back, since, the conception of art, and when art first started, like, art takes a lot of resources, even when you look at, making paintings in the Renaissance, or, making your marble statues. Like, art has never been something that's been environmentally friendly. I do feel like, though, the art world is becoming more conscious of it, which is definitely a good thing. Like, I feel like a lot of artists are also activists for, whatever they're passionate in, whether it be, for racial injustice, or, um, you know, um, just a lot of different like topics, talking about, feminism and sexism, and, those kind of issues. Um, and I think the environment is also definitely one. So I feel like we're kind of making a step in the right direction, but it seems like now with NFTs, we might be taking a step back, which is interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So we are getting close to the end, so we're going to switch to our Q&A section. So to start off with, let's see, we have a few that have been pre-submitted. So I guess this goes, I think all of us here kind of have, I don't want to say an attachment, but we kind of like the physical stuff. Like, I know that Chase, you work with ceramics, and Erika, you do a lot with, the Egyptian pieces and handling the actual artifacts and things like that. And we're living in a world now where everything's moving digital and, to the virtual space. So do we find it scary that art is kind of moving in that direction too now?
I don't necessarily think it's scary, but that mainly is because I'm not an artist and I don't like, my livelihood doesn't rely on making something physical that people will buy. But the thing I like about how digital the art world is becoming is how much more accessible it is to people. Like I feel a lot of like art and history and just the world in general is very classist. So like there's museums that house so many like artifacts like the Louvre or the British Museum and those kind of things that I don't necessarily think I've ever considered going to, just because I don't think I could afford it, either the plane there, the ticket, anything like that. But as the world has become, especially with the pandemic, but as people have begun to digitalize their online collections like we are doing at Raffma, so has other big museums like the Louvre or the British museums. So now instead of flying to Britain or France, I just need to be able to look them up on my computer, which again is not accessible to everyone, but it is taking away a lot of the barriers that made it impossible to do so before. So like I said, I don't make art, so I don't need to worry about the market, but the fact of how much more accessible it is to like everyday people like myself, I am kind of for it in the sense, not for the economic damage or ecological damage it does like with NFTs and things like that, but just like the accessibility and like the destruction of classism and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely deeply value that accessibility to, and especially the amount of opportunities it creates for like historians and all sorts of scholars and students, and to experience like things without the constraints of time, space, money, and not just on our side, but on the museum side. How much work is in the Louvre that you can't see ever, much less in your one day of vacation that you're able to stop into the Louvre. How much of it is stored away underground? How much of it is in a vault somewhere? And so much of that is opened up by these increasingly digital ways of curating and of preserving these works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, and I remember
I'm definitely for like the more ways we can blow this up, the more ways we can spread it out and give it to people, the better.
Mm-hmm. And I remember when I was first hired, at Raffma, and I had my tour of the place. I was shocked about how many other things that we have in the museum that aren't on display. I mean, like we had, I think, like 2 or 3 storage rooms just full of things that, for one reason or another, we don't have space to display, or they're not stable enough to display, or things like that. But now we have all those things available online. So like all of our Egyptian stuff, like we only show a small fraction of the stuff, on the actual, museum floor. Whereas like now we can show the rest of it in our online databases and things like that. And especially like with you guys, doing all the 3D modeling and making it so that we can kind of take that 3D look of objects that we can't in person. Because, when you go to a museum, you're not going to be allowed to pick up the objects and, spin them around and, look them from all angles. Whereas now you can online, which I think definitely add something, and like we said, kind of erases those barriers. As for, I think, from the artist perspective, I will say, at least when I was younger, I was very intimidated by the fact that, like, at least like all my friends, like, they're making digital art, and I'm like, oh, but I like drawing and painting, kind of a thing. um, I don't necessarily think that those traditional arts are going out of style or out of our society necessarily. I just think that we have to kind of adapt what it is. Like, people don't want to buy Renaissance paintings that are made today. Like, I think it just takes ingenuity and, being able to adapt to our ever-changing world, I think. So it seems like, in the art world, there's always going to be a place, at least in my opinion, for the traditional works like sculpting, painting, drawing, photography even. I just think that we have to make room for other art to take their place, such as, digital art. Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's do one more question. What is your actual opinion on Jeff Koons? Is he an artistic genius, or is he kind of just a salesman who's scammed us all?
I mean, sorry, you can go, Chase.
I think a lot of the criticism is not necessarily unfair. It's buzzing. It's not necessarily unfair, but it's a lot of criticism that they wouldn't necessarily level at other people. Like all the time I see people upset how, oh, he doesn't actually do any of his own work. He just directs a team of interns to do it. So he's not a real artist. But how many famous Renaissance painters touched much of a brush in the long run anyways? A lot of that was done by their own students and their own like studio assistants and all that. A lot of the criticism on him is like that, where it's on you know, kind of his structure and how he does things, and it's a little bit unfair sometimes.
Mhm.
But I definitely think he does do it a lot for the sales. He does do it a lot for the money. He isn't necessarily painting that reflective sphere over a masterwork painting because he thinks it's something really interesting and unique and different to say or necessary to say. I think he's doing it because he knows it'll stir up some drama and sell for a big price.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat as Chase, where I think he honestly is a salesman and he's trying to market his work. No matter how great his work might be, he's trying to make money off of it, which, like I said, isn't necessarily a bad thing. So I think he is trying to he's trying to create work that's going to make people buy from him and like know his name. But if that also comes along with some controversy, I don't think he's necessarily opposed to that, because like the saying, the only bad publicity is no publicity. So
Right.
it's like, even if people are saying bad things about me, they're still saying my name. So they're still obviously going to like try and find who I am and like look into me and doing that kind of stuff. So that also gives him more notoriety, more fame, more things like that. And then obviously it also just comes down to like personal preference. Like he might just be getting this controversy because people don't understand what he's doing. But obviously there's going to be someone else that's like, this is the best thing in the world. I want all of it, you know?
Mhm.
So I guess going back to what Chase said, it's kind of split down the middle, where it's either you like him or you don't like him.
Yeah. Yeah. I personally, I'm not the biggest fan of his work. All other factors aside, whether or not he's a salesman or, the meaning of his work, it's just not my type of work personally. I do respect the things that he's doing. I definitely think that when you're, one of the most valuable artists of your time, I do think that's going to come with a lot of criticism. When you make yourself that known out there, it's inevitable that people are going to look at you more harshly than they would otherwise. Do I think that a lot of the criticism is, legitimate and deserved? Maybe, especially like when you look at, the amount of plagiarism, lawsuits that he has.
It's just staggering.
Staggering, yeah. And I don't really know of other artists who, face that much. So I do think that it is deserved. I do think that if he wasn't as known but doing the same thing, I don't think he would have received as much criticism. I do think it's deserved, and I do respect his art, or people who like his art. It's not for me personally. So yeah, I guess that's just my personal opinion. Okay, well, thank you guys for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this podcast. So just some announcements. If you guys enjoyed what you heard here, please join us again for our next podcast, which is in a few weeks. It's on May 6th. We're going to have Kasia Spakowska, I think. I like tried rehearsing her name. And so we'll be talking about dreams, demons, and magic in terms of ancient Egypt. So please do join us for that. That will be our final episode of this season. So we're getting close to the end. So do please join us for that if you enjoyed this one. We also have Cocktails with the Collection tonight at 5 p.m. So please do check that out as well. So thank you again, Chase and Erika, for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Thank you for having us, Lana.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.